Welcome everybody in chat, as well as anybody checking out the video on YouTube later. We're doing the second episode of our Michael's Modern Matchup Guide. It's this video series that we're kicking off where I'm basically going to be approaching all the different matchups in Modern from the perspective of a Death Shadow player. So, like, what I'm looking for in the matchup, what I'm trying to pay attention to, what my game plan is, what kind of sideboarding advice I can give. And we're just going to be going through every matchup at some point. We uploaded episode 1 already on YouTube, which you can see exclamation YouTube in the Twitch chat. Or if you're already on YouTube, you can probably find it pretty easy by going to the main page and going to the playlists. And it'll be under like Michael's Modern Matchup Guides. So we did the first episode on the Cascade decks, the Crashing Football decks. Talked about what we're looking for, what our game plan is, sideboarding, blah, blah, blah. And for this one, we're going to be doing the same thing, but for the 4-color Yorion Pile decks. So we'll take like 20-30 minutes here, kind of give a breakdown of this matchup, and hopefully that'll help somebody to either sideboard better, or if they've got questions, maybe this will help answer those. But as always, I've got to preface all of these videos with saying that always trust your own experience and play recognition and patterns before you trust some random person on the internet. I being random person on the internet. What I mean by this is my sideboarding choices are all broken down because of my independent style. My decision making, my preferences, all of that goes into my sideboarding. So what I do and what works for me may not work for you. And that's okay. If you have a difference of opinions and something else works better for you, always trust yourself. Do what you think is going to work or what has been working for you. Don't change it up just because I do something different. I might have a different opinion of what I'm okay losing to or what I want to make sure I don't lose to. And that can change a lot of the minor decisions that go into sideboarding. So, again, always trust yourself. Paseju casually 60 ticks. Yeah, I think I've cracked like 2 full art ones in the last month and dropped both of those pretty quickly. So, first matchup here, or the matchup of this video, like I said, it's 4-color Yorion Pile. Can also apply to most of like the 5-color piles as well. There might be some minor differences, but it's not going to be anything too extensive. Like, yeah, this one's black for a sideboard, Unmoored Ego. That's fine. Valky's not really changing a whole lot. Like, we're mostly talking about these 4-color value piles with, like, the pitch elementals and planeswalkers and cheap interactions, stuff like that. So, if you haven't played the matchup much, we'll start by going over what the 4-color pile is trying to accomplish. Essentially, it's a let me get to the mid in-game deck. So you're looking at a lot of cards like Lightning Bolt, March, Prismatic Ending, Counterspell, that are all helping you survive those first like 2 or 3 turns. Wrenn and Six and Teferi can fit in that same slot. The pitch elementals fit in that slot. But you're just trying to survive to like turn 4 where you can start getting Omnaths, hard casting elementals, things like that. Multi-spell with expressive iteration of Omnath mana. Anything like that to start outvaluing your opponent to no end. Eventually add Yorion to your hand. Use it to blink things like Omnath, Solitude, Icefang Coatl, your Planeswalkers to reset them. Anything like that. Maybe you've got an Emrakul the Promised End at the top end. It's just a I'm win the game button. But the idea of the deck is just to accumulate extraordinary amounts of value after you get to like that turn 4-ish point, and use that value to overwhelm your opponents with card advantage and with your ability to play more impactful spells in a shorter amount of time than they are. So what does that mean from the shadow side? It means if we get to like that mid to late game and we're not in a position to win, probably not coming back to overwhelm our opponents. Every now and then you'll have a game where a late game expressive iteration runs into like a shadow and a drown in the lock, and you have a removal spell for an Omnath, you're able to drown a Solitude, something like that, and you might be able to pull yourself out of it. But those games are going to be very, very few and far between. So from the shadow side, as soon as we recognize that we're playing against a 4-color pile, which luckily with things like Yorion is pretty easy to assume very early on in the match. As soon as we make that recognition, our focus needs to shift to, all right, we're the aggressor. We're the aggro deck. We're the beat down. We need to get our opponent dead as quickly as possible. We don't need to sit around and wait and let them draw cards and find answers and find payoffs. Like, we can't afford to do that. We've got to get the game over with. So that takes the form, or takes two different forms depending on the variation of shadow that you're playing. A lot of the blue-based shadow decks are, all right, let me present a board state that's going to get me to lethal and have access to cards like Dress Down, Drown in the Lock, that will kind of stop my opponent from being able to interact with my board state. And I'm going to kind of tempo out from there. I'm going to get my threat down. I'm going to counter their impactful spells. I'm going to remove some of the ones that might hit the board that I can afford to let resolve, like an Omnath I can kill with a draw trigger before they play lands, gain life, get mana. If I can do that, that's probably better than countering it some amount of the time. If I can save the counter spell for like a Solitude, a Teferi Time Reveler, a removal spell on my shadow, something like that. For the non-blue shadow decks, so things like Jund Shadow, the focus becomes more about like, let me hit with the hardest hitting hand disruption I can. Let me get a couple threats down. If my opponent's got main deck Supreme Verdict, I'm probably not beating that. But let me get a couple good-sized bodies out and just try to close out the game. Let me not try to out-tempo my opponent by like holding up removal spells. Let me get bodies on the board and into combat and close the game out that way. So that's kind of just a in the blind. You see your opponents on a 4-color deck game plan. Obviously, post-board things change when you start looking for specific hands, specific cards, things like that. So let's go over a little bit of that. It's hard to dissect the game one too much because you don't have a lot of information to go off of. If you see that your opponent is revealing Yorion, you're often looking for a hand with like a cheap threat, hand disruption, and preferably some way to either, if you're on an expressive iteration deck, like use expressive iteration to find more pieces, or if you're on like a battle rage deck, find some way to get to battle rage to end the game, or get to a secondary threat to end the game. Just try to be as proactive as you possibly can. But with Shadow, it's very difficult to mull too aggressively in game one if you don't know 100% that your opponent's on like a Yorion deck or something. Or you know they're on a Yorion deck. You don't know that they're on 4-color elementals or 4-color mid-range. Like maybe you think that they're on blue-white control, whatever. It's hard to adjust your game plan on the fly game one. But that's why we got games 2 and 3, and that's one of the big things we want to talk about here. So I'm breaking this down into 2 styles of Shadow. Number 1 is what I'm calling counter Shadow. It's things like Grixis, Blue-Black Murktide, Esper if you're running like a bunch of Drown in the Locks and Spell Pierces and stuff. Just any of these shadow variants that are fairly high on counter spells. So Flusterstorm, Spell Pierce, Mystical Dispute, Drown in the Lock, actual counter spell, Archmage's Charm, anything like that. And the second variation is essentially the black-green X Shadow. Also includes Mardu Shadow. But it's the Shadow decks that don't have access to counter spells and are relying much more on that fair game plan of hand disruption, threat, try to get a quick clock, probably battle rage kill, something like that. So let's talk about the counter shadow decks first. Sideboarding against the 4-color pile decks. So when you look at your 4-color pile opponent, and this is just kind of like a stock deck list that I pulled off. Most of these decks are going to be probably within 5-6 cards of each other in the sideboard. So don't go too crazy with trying to come up with an idea for every specific variation. But for the most part, I'm thinking of cards like Veil of Summer out of my opponent's sideboard. Endurance, if they're running that. Those are really good options that you see a lot of the time. Not so big on concerning myself with Chalice of the Void, but it's possible. EE is possible. But mostly it's like Veil of Summer, Supreme Verdict, Endurance. And anything past that is probably like your tier 2 sideboard options. So they're there, but for the most part, like their main deck game plan is what you need to be focusing on when you're looking at things like Solitude, Fury, Ice Fang Coatl, Omnath. That's really where you want to focus. Veil of Summer is like your biggest nemesis out of the board, but Endurance is pretty solid. So you're on a counter shadow deck. You're on Grixis, Blue-Black Murktide, Esper, anything like that, and you run into this Yorion Pile player. You have a reasonable idea of what they're going to be bringing in, so what should your game plan be? Let's pull out just like a stock Grixis list. And there's two ways to look at sideboarding. Option number 1 is what do I want to get into my deck? Option number 2 is what do I want to take out of my deck? And kind of the goal of sideboarding is always to have those two options line up fairly well in any given matchup. So for a list, Grixis list like this, I know I want to bring in Turok. Turok's like best card in the matchup by a mile. Dodges Solitude, attacks through Omnath, dodges Teferi Bounce, Prismatic Ending, March of Otherworldly Light, all that stuff. It's basically like Supreme Verdict, Ice Fang Coatl block, or Endurance block are about the only things that are getting it off the board. Fury is a possibility, but Fury is a lot less likely to show up or be in post board. So I would kind of keep an eye on that. After Turok, depending on the style 4-color deck, Spell Pierce can be really good if you see Teferis and Wrenn and 6. It's a little less good against like the primary elemental builds that are running like Risen Reef and all that. Like Risen Reef, Voice of Resurgence, anything past just the main pitch elementals. Dress Down gets better the more elementals they show. So like these two are almost reversible. Like if you see more spells, Spell Pierce is better. If you see more creatures, Dress Down's better. Flusterstorm is pretty good. It's not as great, I think, as Spell Pierce since it doesn't hit Wrenn and 6 and Teferi. But if they are on a spell heavy build with like Prismatic Ending, March of Otherworldly Light, Veil of Summer, Expressive Iteration, all that stuff, Unholy Heat, then Flusterstorm can get some pretty good value. Everything else in the board, Mystical Dispute's about the only other one I'd consider. And it's kind of, if these two are interchangeable, and I'd probably say Flusterstorm comes in more often than not when Spell Pierce comes in, but not often when Dress Down comes in. Mystical Dispute's pretty good against all variations. Hits like Risen Reef, Omnath, Teferi, Expressive Iteration, all those sorts of things. You can use it as a bad mana leak late against like a Solitude, just a hard cast Solitude or Fury, something like that. K Command's pretty weak since most of their removal exiles, like Solitude, Prismatic Ending, all those. They're not often just straight up killing one of your creatures. So sideboarding out. Typically, if I've got like lightning bolts, I'm probably boarding a good number of those out. Unholy Heat is pretty iffy. It kills Solitude. Usually kills like a Wrenn or a Teferi after a down tick, but at that point, they've probably already gotten enough value out of that Planeswalker that they don't care that you've killed it. But the big drawback to Unholy Heat is not being able to kill an Omnath unless you have Delirium. And with them bringing in things like Chalice of the Void sometimes, Endurance, then Unholy Heat can be pretty rough to have online more often than not. Kind of the same with Drown in the Loch. With Wrenn and 6 taking up, getting lands back, Endurance in the deck, Drown in the Loch's a pretty big liability, so I might consider boarding out some number of those. Other than that, probably something like that's about as far down the board outs as I'm going, so I could go something like 6 for 3 and some number of these depending on what I think I'm up against. If I'm up against more of an Elementals base, then Dress Down's really great. Something like that for maybe, or if I'm up against Elementals, something like that for that. If I'm up against more of the spell base, then I'm more likely to not bring in Dress Downs, bring in like Spell Pierce, maybe Flusterstorm, and go something a little more like that, or the Unholy Heat over the 4th Drown. Something like that for that. Just to kind of change it up a little bit depending on what variation of these 4 color piles we're up against. If we are on one of the Jund versions, with Black Green X version, we'll just take something, fairly neutral-ish list here. I don't like lists with, don't want Collector Oof in my list. Like the card, but it's not exactly played right now. But this is just like general idea of cards you'll see in Jund Shadow, like Wrenn, maybe Traverse, Seasoned Pyromancer, or whatever. So here, obviously, Turok's fantastic again. Cards like Liliana the Veil, your multi-for-1 cards are really phenomenal, especially if you get a chance to add value with the tick up on Lily by like ditching a land that you can get back with Wrenn, ditching a Kroxa that you can escape. Something like that will make Liliana a lot better. And then Unlicensed Hearse is good if they're on like the Traverse builds, but otherwise it's pretty weak. And I'd lean more towards like Terminate. So again, that's coming on whether or not they're a creature-based 4-color deck or like a spell-based 4-color deck. It's going to change up a lot of your minor decisions here and there. Board outs. So if you're looking at like those for board ends most of the time, and then add the Unlicensed Hearse if you see like Traverse and stuff like that. Board outs. Temur Battle Rage is usually a very quick board out. Cards like Solitude, March of Otherworldly Light can make that a big liability very quickly. If I'm up against one of the creature-based 4-color decks, then I'm more likely to board out like Traverse because I'm expecting more Endurances. I might board out an Inquisition because it doesn't hit Omnath, Solitude, Fury, Yorion, any of that stuff. If I'm on one of the more spell-based versions and I'm planning on bringing in Unlicensed Hearse, I'll probably keep in Inquisition, board out some number of Unholy Heat, and maybe like a Dismember or something like that. Though I do kind of like Dismember, I'll probably board out Lightning Bolt before I board out Dismember and go something like that 6 for that 6. If you're on a non-standard version of Shadow, so like one of your Mardus, Espers, something like that. Phyrexian Crusader has been an all-star in these matchups. It kind of gives you like Turok 5 through 6, but also adds the ability to just kill quicker than Turok can. But being able to dodge all the white base removal again is phenomenal. Other than that, kind of like Unlicensed Hearse, if you're expecting the cheap interaction, or if you're expecting the cheap interaction into like Traverse again, having that Grave Hate piece for Traverse can be very nice. If you're on a Stoneforge Mystic package, then your swords are both really good. A lot of times I wish I put in like a Sword of Light and Shadow in the sideboard, just for matchups that like Shadow itself was really bad. You could board it out, board in Light and Shadow, plus like Crusaders, Turoks. And I actually think that would be a very reasonable sideboard plan. But out of the main, against a lot of these elemental decks, like Lightning Bolt's pretty weak. Path is fine. Prismatic Ending can be okay. K-Command's pretty bad. So you can see like K-Command coming out. Caldra's not great if they're on a bunch of Prismatic Endings. But it might not be one that you just jump it cutting. Unearth can be pretty rough if they're on a bunch of Endurances. Then something like some Lightning Bolts for Turoks, Crusaders. You want the Terminate in, you can board another Lightning Bolt out, since Terminate's always going to kill everything Lightning Bolt does, but Lightning Bolt's not always going to kill everything Terminate does. In the case of Omnath, Endurance, Yorion, like I usually err towards the side of bringing in removal that's going to kill anything and figure it out after that. For decks like Esper, Turok's great, Dothy's reasonable, Fulminator Mage is good, Spell Pierce is great, Ranger Captain's a little weaker. It does just offer extra copies of Shadow, but you're not really getting any effect out of the sack part, so most of the time it's just going to be a 3/3 body, which is pretty mediocre. But then you've got like Unearths that can come out pretty easily. You can board out some number of Street Wraiths if you just want extra cards to bring in. Kind of give a general idea there. So then you've got like the play versus draw consideration. What you're looking for those opening hands. If I'm on the play post board against the Yorion decks, for most of my Shadow builds, I'm looking for like turn 1 Ragavan, if I can find it, or turn 1 Thoughtseize. Like just something to be proactive on turn 1, because I don't want to pass the turn doing nothing, have them have mana, and now they've got Veil of Summer up for now until forever. Like I want something impactful that they have to deal with on turn 1. After turn 1, it becomes a lot of, can I play around like a specific Planeswalker? Like, I don't want to go turn 1, Thoughtseize, turn 2, play out a Ragavan, them have Wrenn 6 and ping it, because now they're far ahead. But at the same time, I don't want to do nothing on those early turns, because their entire game plan is trying to survive those first early turns. So if I'm able to go like turn 1 Ragavan, they Unholy Heat it, then I might just try to play like turn 2 Fetch Shock, Cycle Street Wraith, Shadow, just to get something on the board and start presenting pressure. Because if you sit back and give them a bunch of extra draw steps, they're going to find some way to deal with what you've got going on. So primary goal is just to give them fewer draw steps. Maybe that means turn 2 Naked Turok. If you don't have the 4 mana to kick it, it could mean turn 2. I guess what I'm trying to say is I really don't want to get into a situation where my turn 1 is nothing and my turn 2 is like front half of a Croxa. And my opponent just doesn't care about those 2 turns at all. Because now I've just gotten them halfway to Omnath without presenting any sort of reasonable pressure or any sort of actual disruption. So that's something to keep in mind. Like, if you can play to the board in those first 2 turns, I would always recommend playing to the board instead of like sitting back and trying to hold up mana and interact. If you're in the blue side and you've got Spell Pierce, I would hold up mana for Wrenn and 6 and Teferi. But that's about the only time that I would hold up mana if you can manage it. But it also needs to be like play out something and hold up mana, not just hold up like Drown in the Loch for Wrenn and 6. Because then if they don't cast the Wrenn and 6, you just wasted your entire turn trying to be kind of cheeky, and it didn't work out. And then you run the risk of, all right, they go to turn 3, I'm holding up Drown in the Loch, they go Wrenn and 6, I drown, they Veil of Summer, and I just got extraordinarily blown out for that line. If you're on one of like the black-green variations of Shadow, or a non-counterspell version, then just about anything you can do the first couple turns is a good start. So out of the black-green versions, Hand Disruption of Ragavan on 1, Tarmogoyf for Shadow on 2 is a really good start. Out of like the Mardu and Esper versions, turn 1 Hand Disruption, turn 2 Stoneforge Mystic, get like a Sword of Fire and Ice and strap it up. That'll get you a long way. Dodge the pings off, or the bounce off Teferi, dodges Omnath in the way, dodges Fury, gets almost as big as Endurance. Just ways to be able to untap like that. Feast and Famine's a great option. Mirabito, what's up? So anything like that. On the draw, it gets a lot dicier. So if you're on a Ragavan version on the draw, I would almost never recommend playing out Ragavan turn 1 if you have the option. Because if you go turn 1 Ragavan, your opponent plays Wrenn and 6 and down ticks, you've almost snap lost that game. Because even if you untap and you Unholy Heat the Ragavan, you're still behind on having your best threat off the board. You're behind on that Unholy Heat off the board. And you're probably not doing anything with your 1 leftover mana because you can't Tarmogoyf. You can't Thoughtseize plus Shadow. You're letting your opponent untap on turn 3 with open mana that they might be able to do something like cast a Teferi. You can't hold up Drown in the Loch because your opponent's just going to start getting lands back from their graveyard. So if you can dodge that, I would rather play into the turn 1 Veil of Summer with Inquisition or Thoughtseize than play out my Ragavan and have them untap and Wrenn and 6 down tick. Because at least I know if they have the Veil on turn 1 and they play Wrenn and tick up on turn 2, I can dash Ragavan or something to start building my mana. But if I let them kill it, game's over. For the non-black-green, non-blue-green variation, or blue-black variations of Shadow, any of your value 2 drops are really good. So, like, Stoneforge Mystic, we mentioned a few times. Alright, so yeah, like Ledger Shredder, Stoneforge Mystic. The Rogues is not the worst. If you can double up like Esper Sentinel, Hand Disruption, something like that, that's going to be a pretty reasonable play for you. Might not win you the game, but you're not designed to play that same game as the Black-Green X versions or the Blue-Black X versions of having counter spells or Tarmogoyf, which are usually your best turn 2 plays. Get down like a good-sized proactive threat or have interaction for whatever they're doing on turn 2, turn 3. What else we got? I think that's most everything. If anybody has any specific questions in chat or anything they're really curious about when it comes to the 4-color pile matchups, whether it be spell-based, elementals, anything in between. Are there any cheeky plays here? If I'm on the play and I have the option to counter an abundant growth off of like a spell pierce, I usually will. Because a lot of times they'll go for the basic forest and then the abundant growth. So being able to spell pierce an abundant growth or like an Oath of Nissa or something might be able to set up or might be able to keep them off of a big potential turn 2 play. Maybe they have to fetch a tap Triome and you have a little bit of a time walk. So how would you board against Pile with Missionary Shadow? So, stock Missionary Shadow. Aptly named because it's the boring, unspicy shadow option. Kind of like missionary sex. Don't let your kids watch this video. So, if I'm up against 4-color, there's 2 different board plans. We kind of went over it briefly before you got here, but we can be explicit with this one. Time to play Shadow again. I don't know if I would go that far. The 4-color pile matchups, which I know you're very familiar with the 4-color pile side, are very rough. Alright, so if I'm up against the spell-based versions of 4-color, so we're talking like the non-Risen Reef, non-Voice of Resurgence, anything like that, variations. The ones that are more prismatic ending, prismatic ending, Unholy Heat, Expressive Iteration, March of Otherworldly Light, Planeswalkers, those things. Of course, I still remember you. I don't know, when did you change your name to Ricardo? But I do remember the emote. So I can't count how many times you'd spam that in the Death Shadow discords. Yeah, I know, Dito. Like, that's why I was wondering about the Ricardo. Unless it's always been Ricardo and just nobody ever said anything. Alright, so the spell-based versions. Spell Pierce, Mystical Dispute, Flusterstorm are all pretty decent options. Turok's fantastic. Terminate, maybe. Depends how badly I want to deal with resolve stuff, like how my main deck removal lines up. But I would say like first set of board ends, second set. So like Spell Pierce to interact with all the cheap interaction that they've got, the Planeswalkers. Mystical Dispute deals with Teferi, Expressive Iteration, Omnath on curve, Yorion on curve, stuff like that. Turok dodges most of their removal that you care about. Prismatic Ending, Teferi, Solitude, March of Otherworldly Light. And then most of the other interaction is based on how aggressively you think you have to play in those matchups. Board outs, I'm usually looking at like some number of drowns out because of endurance, because of Wrenn and 6 picking up lands, things like that. Lightning bolts, usually pretty quick cut. Some number of Unholy Heats I'm usually cutting. Mainly because like Lightning bolt's not killing Omnath. It's not killing Yorion. Unholy Heat, if they've got endurance, isn't going to kill a lot of those things. Isn't going to kill Fury, Omnath, endurance, a lot of the Planeswalkers if you don't have Delirium active. So I'd often want some number of Terminates over some number of Unholy Heat. And from there, it just depends on how much you want to hedge. Like, you could board out Fatal Push for another Unholy Heat or another Terminate if you want to deal more with the pitch elementals. You could keep Fatal Push in if you'd rather be mana efficient at dealing with Omnath or mana efficient at dealing with Ice Fang Coatls, Risen Reef, something like that. if they are on the more elemental version, then I'm bringing in dress downs for sure. I could bring it in against the normal piles. Depends on what I feel like I'm really having an issue with. But the dress downs are always going to be better if your opponent's playing like Risen Reef and stuff like that on top of the normal elementals. So if I think that they're being more on the creature base, like Risen Reef, stuff like that, I'm probably leaving in some more Unholy Heats, boarding out a couple more Drowns, and going something a little bit more like that in for something like that out. Or I might take out like a Croxa and leave in another Unholy Heat. Something like that. Drown in the Lock's not going to be able to counter stuff if they have Cavern of Souls. And a lot of the time, like this smaller removal is going to trade 1-for-1 with something that's already gotten like draw value. So if I'm going to trade 1-for-1 with something, I'd rather be able to trade 1-for-1 with like Omnath every time. Or Fury Hardcast, Solitude Hardcast, something like that. So that's kind of the 2 cents on sideboarding there. But good question. So if that is all, I think we'll cut the YouTube video for this one and start getting into some gameplay.